Hello and welcome back to History 120, the early history of the United States of America. And this week I want to talk about the American Revolution. We've built up to this point so far. Our readings last week talked about slavery, colonial development, and the issues in early America. But ultimately, for many people, for our history, the Revolution is one of the obviously early defining moments. And I know that sounds redundant. That sounds odd. Why is Dr. Welch saying this? Is duh. But when the revolution started, it wasn't for sure going to succeed. There were a lot of issues at play, and everything needed to fall in just the right place, if you would, for the American Revolution to succeed. So today I want to talk about the revolution, its various aspects. There's no one monolithic approach to the revolution, and here just give it a bit of a review. Obviously, your readings will go a little bit further in. The revolution at first is the Massachusetts War. Obviously, starting with Lexington and Concord, we have a war that is isolated to Massachusetts because of the various intolerable acts that we've discussed in previous weeks, the legislation going on. Boston is seen as the center of rabble rousing. The war is not a true pan-colonial event at this time. It is generally relegated to New England and especially Massachusetts. Now, militants in other colonies are seeking to establish aid, to show support for Massachusetts, but we haven't seen that fully develop at this point. As the troops pull back from the battles of Lexington and Concord, the militiamen who have responded to the call are going to place Boston under siege. They are going to surround the city. They are going to build bastions and fortifications. They are going to pen the British Army up into the city and really catch the British Army on its back foot. The British Army are not prepared for a rebellion at this level. But it's a major issue. It's a major development here that we've been able to force the British Army back, and this siege will last for just about a year. Imagine that. Imagine a major American city under siege for almost a year, as these rebels are holding off the greatest army on the face of the earth. And I'm not using hyperbole there. At the end of the 18th century, the British Army truly is one of the greatest military organizations in human history. And this ragtag group of rebels is able to hold them at bay. As word of this spreads, support is going to grow. We're going to start seeing the colonies on some level taking action to purge themselves of the British presence, to start to oppose. But remember, this isn't official action. These may be colonies in rebellion, but that doesn't mean that every government is automatically capitulated. One of the major turning points in this siege is the capture of the Fort Ticonderoga near the New York Canadian border. With the exception of a few undersized town artillery pieces, the militia that have been holding the British at bay have been riflemen. They have been soldiers with muskets. There's no real heavy artillery that can actually threaten the British inside their fortifications. So on some level, without artillery, the city may be under siege, the British may be forcibly opposed, but they're not severely threatened. And what happens is a man named Henry Knox, who is a bookseller in Boston, um, a very zealous patriot, but a very educated man who is personally fascinated with artillery, is going to help lead an expedition to help seize Fort Ticonderoga, which is woefully undermanned. There's not much of a garrison, and the garrison will surrender really without a shot fired. But when the fort falls, the entire reason they've sent an expedition up to Fort Ticonderoga is to go and capture the fort's heavy artillery pieces. We see an artist's rendition here of the ox teams that were necessary to bring back these artillery pieces during wintertime, which actually made it was cold, it was a harsh march, I'm not going to deny that, but the conditions actually made it easier in some ways to bring the artillery back on sleds, which expedited the process. But this gives artillery to the Massachusetts militiamen. Now they can, over the course of several nights, in some cases almost overnight, move fortifications, create new artillery redoubts, and dig in on the hills around Boston and place these new artillery pieces. And there is literally a morning in May of 1775 where the British wake up and there is artillery emplaced in the hills around Boston, and the entire military situation changes. Now the colonists can fire down into the city at their leisure. They can actually endanger British lives, they can endanger British ships in the harbor, and this is going to help expedite the process of ending the siege and really transforming this from a one city rebellion into a much larger war. Probably the most famous battle in this period of time is the Battle of Bunker Hill, which doesn't take place on Bunker Hill. It takes place on Breed's Hill, where the British Army, as we can see imagined in this painting, are going to use their very rigid training, their very rigid linear tactics, and they're going to try and force the Americans off of one of these hilltops to try and open the way at Charlestown. And essentially what happens is the British are slaughtered. It is one of the earliest large scale losses of life for the British Army in the war, because they march right into the mouths of the riflemen in these American breastworks. They fire into these ranks, and the British, who have sent their grenadiers, their heavy infantry, the men who are the largest physical examples of what it means to be a soldier, the best, in some ways the best soldiers, the roughest soldiers in the British Army, are pushed back twice by Americans with muskets firing into their faces. The British think that they can literally march straight into the American position and the Americans will run away. And honestly, the British don't succeed until the Americans start to run low on ammunition. The British don't change their tactics. They fight by the textbook into this American entrenchment, and they suffer dearly for it. Fighting is underway. We've seized a fort. We have a situation at hand where fighting has broken out. Artillery has been stolen from the British. The British grenadiers have been have severely bloodied. And honestly, even in the midst of all of this, even with rebellion still at hand, the Second Continental Congress is still trying to seek a political solution and avoid a war. The Second Continental Congress will be called in May of 1775 to meet in Philadelphia. And despite the fact that they're still trying to petition the king, they're still trying to find a middle ground, which is going to take a very long time to get back and forth across the ocean. They also realize that we need to organize in order to see this rebellion out if the political solution cannot be found. In June, they will create a Continental Army, which is essentially the birth of the United States Army. They can't rely. A successful rebellion cannot rely on just random um, militiamen showing up and fighting whenever they please. They need to have a disciplined fighting force. They need to have a trained fighting force. So in June of 1775, we see this moment where the army is created, and obviously you need somebody to lead the army. Well, of course, we've got George Washington. Well, this is George Washington in his French and Indian War uniform. What's interesting is this is George Washington as he appeared in the Second Continental Congress. He was a delegate. Washington was a man who had always dreamed of military prestige, of being a high-ranking officer in the British Army. And so when the Second Continental Congress is called, he actually shows up every single day in his military uniform in order to, in some ways, in a gentlemanly way, say, well, yes, I have some military experience. Maybe I could be convinced to lead this army. And so it's this subtle yet not subtle way of saying I would be willing to be an officer that ultimately gets Washington leadership of the Continental Army. It's also the fact that if they put a Massachusetts man in charge of the army, then that is going to reinforce this belief that it's just a Massachusetts rebellion. By putting Washington in charge of the Continental Army, we now see that we have a Virginian, a man separated by 1,000 miles from Massachusetts, is also involved in this moment of rebellion. The Second Continental Congress is going to draw up a document declaring their causes for rebellion, but at the same time, they're also working on an olive branch petition, sending a document to London to say, we are willing to remain loyal subjects of the British Empire if. And ultimately, later that summer, the King of England will declare the American colonies in a state of open rebellion against the British Empire, and no matter what happens from there, there's no going back. The colonies are in rebellion. It's either win or be crushed, and you don't want to lose a rebellion in the age of the British Empire. Honestly, the laws still on the books at the time. If Washington is defeated, if the Americans lose the rebellion, to be brutally honest, the leaders of the rebellion will be hung, drawn, and quartered. That's how the British common law deals with treason. You will be hung by the neck until you are almost dead. You will be then tied out on a table. You will be disemboweled, have your intestines removed from the body while you're still barely alive. You will then be quartered. Your body will be divided into four, generally by animals if you go really old school. And those portions of your body will be sent around to various places of the empire or the areas in rebellion to show that this is the punishment for treason. Would that have really happened? I don't know. But that is the punishment on the books for treason at this time. So these are the political leaders. They're looking for a political solution. They're making political preparations to see this rebellion through. Where's everybody else on this? It used to be the saying was about a third of the population of the colonies were loyalists supporting Great Britain. A third of the population were patriots hoping to win independence, and about a third of the population were neutral, didn't actually care because the British Empire didn't affect their daily lives. Current scholarship, more recent scholarship, has really kind of come up with the idea really only about 20% of the population were patriots and 20% were loyalists. So the vast majority of people living in the colonies in the 1770s didn't care as long as they were able to live their daily life. And so we need to keep that in mind, that when we talk about the American war for independence, this wasn't a universally supported moment in time. All right, so we've had the Olive Branch petition. We've had this declaration that from Great Britain that the colonies are in an open state of rebellion. What's next? What do we do? Honestly, if the Crown has declared that the colonies are in an open state of rebellion and they're not willing to listen to any of the grievances or listen with any type of open arms to the issues that the Americans are dealing with or want to have addressed, then the leaders of the rebellion say it's time for us to declare ourselves a nation. And so the Congress meets again in the spring of 1776, and they come to the conclusion after a lot of debate that they need to sever ties with Great Britain. And this isn't an initially universal belief. There are colonies and leaders in this rebellion that still want to have a political solution, that still want to negotiate with Great Britain, that think that armed rebellion is foolish. And it takes a lot of convincing. And ultimately, what we see are the individual colonies begin to take the steps of separating themselves from the empire. They write new constitutions that create an independence for themselves. We see this sense of the creation of republican-style governments, smaller. That means that it's going to be somewhat representative. It creates power structures not reliant upon the king, but upon elections. Essentially, what we're talking about is the establishment of self-government in the various colonies. We're creating the states. That's all well and good, but we still need to create a unified sense of what is happening. Because if you act as a bunch of independent colonies, a bunch of independent states, they can be picked off one by one. You can turn one against the other. It doesn't lead ultimately to a successful rebellion. What happens is on June 7th, 1776, one of the Lee brothers, representatives from Virginia, presents a resolution that you see here. This is the original Lee resolution. Resolved that these colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the rule of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. The Lee resolution in June of 1776 is the final. It's the final line to cross. If the Lee resolution is passed, there's no going back. There's no seeking political allegiance. It is victory or death for the American colonies. It's a moment we don't tend to deal with very much on a personal level. It's very rare in our lives that we say that we are doing this and we are moving forward. This is a very dramatic statement to make. And in June of 1776, it passes. This is the moment. We send Jefferson and John Adams and Ben Franklin and a couple other guys who ultimately just kind of leave and don't help out at all to create a Declaration of Independence. And there's a lot of debate about how this declaration should be passed. What's going to happen? Can you pass this? And what happens if states abstain? What happens if states don't vote for it? And really, the best illustration of this moment that I've seen is in this video clip from the HBO miniseries John Adams. If you go to the PowerPoint file and click on this link, The Moment of Decision, this is a very good, very well-researched illustration of that moment where the colonies agree on the course forward. Obviously, this is the Declaration of Independence. This is the moment that America declares themselves before the world to be an independent nation. And on July 12, 1776, after the passage of the Declaration of Independence on the 3rd, we see the establishment of the Confederation of American Colonies, with the first national government trying to act as a unifying organization for all these colonial states. So that's my time for right now for the first session. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about the war on the military and strategic level, and we'll get to discuss one of my favorite battles. I hope everybody's enjoyed this so far. If you have any questions as this course keeps going, remember, folks, send me an email, and I would be glad to help you with any issues you have. And have a great day.